Well, first of all, welcome everybody to this event that's been put on by the Friends of Belsize Community Library. I'm Anthony Isaacs, chair of the Friends. Our purpose is to promote and support the library, which has been run by the Winch, a local children's charity since 2012, and is largely dependent on charitable funding. Our Zoom events are free, but if you feel you can make a donation to the library, I've placed a link to the donation site in the chat box, so please have a look at that and donate if you can. Could I ask everybody to make sure that their microphones are muted throughout the event, unless invited to speak? We'll see how we get on with that later on. So it's my very great pleasure tonight to be able to welcome Jon Sopel. Jon, I'm sure, is very well known to you from his work at the BBC. He graduated from the University of Southampton in 1981 in politics and sociology, and within a short space of time had joined BBC Radio Solent and has gone on to great things since then. He's been 3 years as BBC Paris correspondent. He's been a presenter, reporter, chief political correspondent for BBC News. He's written 3 books during his time as North American editor, which he's been since 2014, capturing the rise and fall of Donald Trump. And we will hear more anon. After Jon finishes speaking, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So please, could you place any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. If anybody has got a particular request to speak, raise your hand using the raise hand function, and we'll try to accommodate that if we can, depending on how much time we've got available. Now, Jon obviously is very pressed. There's an awful lot going on over there, as you might imagine, and he'd like to finish in about an hour. So if there are questions, perhaps we can make sure they're short and to the point. Anyway, from there, we'll go over to you, Jon.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Good evening to all of you, and a good afternoon from Washington, DC, where I'm sitting now, and the sun is shining, and wonderful cause to support the Belsize Community Library. So kind of, yes, do donate. And I wish I was in NW3 with you instead of in Georgetown in Washington. I'm going to reflect a bit over my past 7 years of having been North America editor, which has been, I suppose, if in 2014, when there was the interview panel appointing me or appointing someone to be the new North America editor, which, let's face it, is the most prestigious foreign job that the BBC has. And I had gone into that interview and they had said, Jon, how do you see the 2016 presidential election? And I had said, well, it's clear Donald Trump's going to be the next president of the United States of America. I would not have got the job because people would have thought that was just simply preposterous. And I'd been here a relatively short time. I was doing the tail end of the Obama presidency and the Obama administration. I interviewed Barack Obama at the White House in the Roosevelt Room. And every word he said, you felt he put it on the scales before it came out of his mouth. Everything was weighed and measured and careful and thought through, occasionally slightly ponderous, slightly slow. He was actually incredibly charming. But that was who he was. And it was hard to imagine that America was going to make this gigantic flip to go 180 degrees and have a president like Donald Trump, because America had never had anyone like that in its history. And I say that advisedly. The only people that had ever risen to be president before either had experience of elected office or had served in a senior capacity in the military. Donald Trump had avoided military service and he had never held elected office. So he was unique. And there was a casual assumption made that when Donald Trump ran for the presidency, the line was that the presidency would change Donald Trump wouldn't change the presidency. And that was wrong. And it was very clear to me at an early stage that there was a fervor and an enthusiasm and a willingness to not use the usual rules by which you judge politicians. Donald Trump had 5 children from 3 different marriages. Just imagine for a second that narrative if it was Barack Obama who'd had 5 children from 3 different marriages, what would be said about him? Donald Trump defied the rules of political gravity almost in a way that the nearest I've seen to it in the UK is our present Prime Minister, who I was with the other night in Washington at a party at the British Embassy, and he was on cracking form and very entertaining. Donald Trump, though, even more so. And I think that people, so when Donald Trump, in one of the televised debates with Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign, said, Hillary Clinton accused him of not paying his taxes. He says, yeah, that's because I'm smart. I think that would have normally been the death knell for a politician. Donald Trump gets more popular by it. There was the release of that tape from Access Hollywood, where he talks about, we're after the watershed. He talks about grabbing women by the, I don't need to finish the sentence, but it was pretty crude what he said. Again, in a puritanical country like America, and it is still quite puritanical, that would have been the end of it. But Donald Trump tapped into something that Hillary Clinton just simply couldn't. And that was this sense that people were fed up. They wanted a change. They were sick of politics as normal. They were sick of conventional wisdom. They didn't care that Donald Trump was different. They reveled in how different he was and wanted more of it. And he had, if you were to transcribe one of Donald Trump's rally speeches, I think, frankly, it would be gibberish, because there are fractured sentences and they wander off in all different directions, and there are subclauses and you don't quite know what he's going or what he's going to say. That said, he's a brilliant communicator, because you get exactly what he means. And so he came out during the 2016 election and said, we're going to build a wall. We're going to keep the Mexicans out. We're going to renegotiate trade deals. We're going to keep Muslims out. We're going to treat our veterans better. And it was very clear, top lines, brilliant, easy to understand, easy to grasp hold of. Hillary Clinton, what were her top lines? I always struggled when I went on the 10 o'clock news to explain what it was that Hillary Clinton would be about. So Donald Trump won fair and square. There was much more enthusiasm for him than there was for Hillary Clinton. Yeah, there was misogyny as well in some of the voting as well, but Donald Trump won. And he continued to govern as he campaigned. I mean, there was the line from a previous governor of New York who said, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And Donald Trump absolutely carried on governing. And I can't begin to describe the chaos, the dysfunction, occasionally the dishonesty of what went on. And it was very challenging for people like me who are part of an impartial media. What do we do on day one? On day one of Donald Trump's presidency, the inauguration was on the Friday. Saturday is his first full day in the presidency, and he claims that the crowd for his inauguration was the biggest in history. And you just had to compare a photo taken from the Washington Monument at the same time as Barack Obama's first inauguration to Donald Trump's inauguration, and that just wasn't true. Barack Obama's audience was huge. I mean, not that any of this matters. It's not a significant fact. But at some point you have to say, but that's not true. And I think that the BBC, in fairness to, and rightly said, well, if it's not true, we've got to call it out. We didn't go down the route of on the one hand and on the other. And so that was a good first step, I think, because I think that journalism, I've been a in the BBC now, my God, you know, people who committed mass murder get less time than I've had in the BBC. I've been in the BBC for 35 plus years, and I have loved it. I've always enjoyed my career. But as things stand today, in 2021, I have never thought that journalism has been more important. Fair, balanced, impartial journalism has been more important because of the challenges that are being faced by democracy. On social media, people getting their Facebook feeds, which are full of absolute nonsense and fake news. But because it's come to their feed, the algorithm has decided that they should look at this, and they believe it to be the case. Conventional news reporting is in decline. In America, I can't tell you how unwatchable so much of it is, because there is no pretense at giving you the facts or whatever. It is opinion dressed up as news. And I think that is potentially dangerous. And as someone whose grandparents came to this country as refugees fleeing persecution, living in a liberal democracy where there are free and fair elections, where there is due process, where there is the rule of law, where there is freedom of speech, are things that I kind of cherish quite dearly. And I think that it's not my job as a journalist to tell people that they should vote for Brexit or against Brexit, that they should vote for Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I do want people to be well informed when they go to the ballot box, that they feel they're able to make judgments, and whatever their worldview is, but they've got it based on fact and not on the fiction that has been perpetrated. And I think that one thing I thought I would look, journalistically, the period of Donald Trump, I will look back on these years of being in Washington, and I suspect I'm not going to be here for very much longer because I've done 7 years. I told my wife I think we'd probably be here for 3, at the most 4 years, and it's now 7. I will look back and think what a golden period it was to be alive, because there was so much demand for news because Donald Trump was so newsworthy. And so you were always on the television. I didn't have any, I could barely write my own name when I came out here 7 years ago, and I've written 3 books since I've been here. That was never part of the plan. I never envisaged that when I was this young idiot schoolboy at Christ College Finchley, aged 13 or 14, could I have ever envisaged that I would be arguing with the President of the United States in the East Room of the White House at a televised news conference that was going around the world? I mean, my mother, my parents are dead, would have been horrified at the idea that I was arguing with the President of the United States. But it's what it called for, because there was so much that was contentious about what was being said. So it was a fascinating period. And then you get to November 2020. My most recent book, Unprecedented, which is now out in paperback, and I thoroughly recommend it, and is only just come out, and it's got an additional new chapter, blah, 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 available at Daunts, available at Waterstones, available at Amazon, all the usual blurb. Let me get that out of the way now. It was a diary of the presidential election campaign. And there's a lot I get wrong. What I haven't done is revisited diary entries to make myself look like I had the wisdom of Solomon and foresight beyond, what would be reasonable. So you see me saying, oh my God, Joe Biden, I can't believe anyone's going to elect him to be the president of the United States. He's so sleepy and slow and, all the rest of it. So that's but the one thing I did say months before the election in my diary entries was that Donald Trump only sees 2 conceivable outcomes of this election. One is that he wins. The other is that it's stolen. Defeat was never, ever going to be part of his lexicon. And so if you see things in that context, and then you get to November 2020, and more terrifying, you get to January the 6th, 2021, then simultaneously, what you are talking about and reporting on is the most shocking thing that you could have ever imagined. but also simultaneously the most predictable. Because shocking, on January the 6th, the mob took over Capitol Hill. They took over Congress. And it was unbelievable. I had been at this place called the Ellipse in the morning, and the Ellipse is the patch of ground that runs south of the south lawn of the White House to the Washington Monument. And if you carried on, you'd end up in the Potomac River. And that's where the Trump addressed the crowds and various other Trump supporters. And Donald Trump was saying things along the line of, we've got to fight like hell for our country. You've got to march up to Capitol Hill and tell these people what you think of them. Did he incite a riot? Exactly? No, but he had tweeted, "Come to Washington, it's going to be wild." And the crowd that had gathered that morning was in a sulfurous mood. And I have covered dozens of Trump rallies over the 4 years he was president, the year before when he was campaigning to be the president. And it was clear to me that day that there was something different about the crowd. The crowds of Donald Trump rallies are always rather joyous. They're kind of people that are dressed up. There's a slightly fiesta atmosphere. And the mood on January the 6th was dark. There were people spoiling for a fight. And I interviewed these guys, and this guy was wearing RoboCop body armor. And I said, "Are you spoiling? You look like you're here for a fight." He said, "No, but if a fight starts, I'm ready for it." I would later that day, see a photograph of him dangling from a parapet in the Senate, on the balcony, about to leap down onto the Senate floor, and he's now faced charges. He had driven from Boise, Idaho, to come to this rally. So that was, a round trip of about 3,000 miles, I think, so that he could be there on January the 6th. So Donald Trump had incited all these people to believe that the election had been stolen. And I just want to dwell on that for a moment, because if you believe in the rule of law and you believe in free and fair elections with electoral officers whose job it is to count and report faithfully what has happened, by every measure, Donald Trump lost the election. There is no doubt. There were 73 court cases brought by the Trump campaign to challenge aspects of the results. All but one of them, and it was a narrow victory in Pennsylvania about the right to be able to watch votes being counted, were thrown out as vexatious, unworthy, and unsubstantial. So the court cases did not succeed. Donald Trump challenged the court cases, the results. That's within his rights. They were thrown out. The 50 returning officers for the states, or they're called the Secretary of State for each state, his job declared the results safe. The Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, appointed by Donald Trump, declared the election safe. The head of election security in the United States, again, a Republican appointed by Donald Trump, said it was the safest election in American history. So where is there evidence that the election was stolen? And it's my contention there isn't any. And that again put the BBC in an interesting position where we are then saying, so there was one night on the 10 o'clock news where they were going to say, although Donald Trump claims that the election was stolen. And I said, well, you need, if you're going to put that line into the bulletin, you need to add of which there is no evidence, because there is no evidence. And the more you do it, the more you undermine people's faith in democracy. And going back to what I was saying earlier, I kind of like liberal democracy. I like the fact that if we think our politicians have done an absolutely bloody awful job, we can boot them out. And that people should have confidence, though, that when they go to vote, their vote will be counted and counted fairly. And so I think it was a really interesting period for us. And I think that it's a challenge that is ongoing for journalists and journalism. And for free and open societies of how do you counter falsehood when there is so much of it around. Now look, politicians down the ages have always wanted to shape a narrative and fashion facts to suit their own kind of purposes. Nothing new. And it's our job to say, well, yeah, up to a point that's true. But if you look at it in the round, well, maybe it's not quite as they say it. And I don't care who it is. So I think that is a real ongoing challenge for the world and for societies at large. And that's why I think that, you know, my profession is actually quite important right now. Let me say, I want to leave lots of time for you to ask your questions. So I just want to talk a bit about the Biden presidency. Actually, the day after the January the 6th protests, I was doing a live report on the 6 o'clock news, and Sophie Rayworth was presenting in the studio. And she cues over to me. There were still a lot of Trump supporters around. I had got as close to the Capitol building as I could go. And they were chanting and jeering at me while I was doing the broadcast. And they were very close. You know, I didn't have any security around me. And I did think at one point, what am I going to do if I get overrun? And there were these two guys who were chanting at me, "You lost, go home. You lost, go home," while I'm on air. And I'm thinking, you lost. Do they what? They think I'm a Democrat and that I should go back to England. I couldn't quite figure it out. Now this is while I'm broadcasting. And so at the end of the broadcast, I said, guys, you know, it's not. I'm trying to do my job. I've got First Amendment rights and free speech as well. And you were trying to drown me out. But that chant, "You lost, go home," what does it mean? Well, this guy jabs me in the chest and goes, 1776. Holding me responsible for the redcoats, for George III. I thought about saying, I think my family in 1776 were in Poland, peasants, uneducated, not really terribly aware of what was happening. I just thought, no, it's going to complicate things still further. So I just let that go. But that was the sort of atmosphere there was. Biden came in. It was like going from smoking a crack pipe every day to having a half of lemonade shandy once a week. That is the only way I can describe the difference between Trump and Biden. There was sleepy old Joe Biden. They loved the fact that, you know, the White House almost seemed to revel in the fact that they wanted to lower the temperature. They wanted to turn down the volume. They wanted to turn down the divisiveness within American society. And America is so deeply polarized on everything that even the simple act of wearing, you know, a face mask is seen. You know, people are being thrown out of restaurants for wearing one, not being thrown out of restaurants for not wearing one. But in Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and I did a report down in Louisiana and Mississippi about 4 weeks ago, and it's terrifying. I mean, the level of vaccine take-up is in some areas 35%, because people think it's fake news and they don't need to go and get vaccinated. And of course, surprise, surprise, the ICU unit, you know, intensive care units are overflowing, and there are people dying, and all the people that are dying haven't been vaccinated. So there are real problems in American society. Joe Biden started off moderately well, but there have been a number of missteps. Most notably, I think in Europe, you would say what happened with the pullout from Afghanistan, which seemed ill-judged, ill-conceived, ill-planned, and looked, you know, I'm sure Joe Biden would love to be able to portray this and create a narrative that this was America's Dunkirk when the British Expeditionary Force was rescued off the beaches of northern France and brought home. It looked more like the fall of Saigon with the last Huey helicopter going off the roof of the US Embassy there. You know, people clinging to the side of the C-17 transporter aircraft were terrible, terrible pictures for Joe Biden. And the latest approval ratings that I've seen show that Biden is slumping and that Trump is rising. And so I'm going to end in a moment with just this thought that, you know, Donald Trump is still defining the terms of the debate on the Republican side of America. He retains an enormous power. over elected officials because of the unique way that politicians get elected here, which is that the election itself is far less important than the primary race that precedes it. So are you going to be the Republican nominee for this state, for this district? If you say a word against Donald Trump has got a huge war chest. He is going to run a candidate against you in the primary to boot you out so that you can't fight the seat come the election. So Donald Trump may not be the candidate himself. His hold on the American public may have diminished since the election, but his ability to influence the shape of Republican politics going forward is undiminished. And so whether Trump himself runs again or not, we'll see. Donald Trump has hinted that he will run. I think it will be entirely poll driven. I don't think he could face the humiliation. His ego would not be able to take another defeat. Meantime, you've got Joe Biden, who looks every bit of his 78 years. Age has been kind to Donald Trump in that he still seems vigorous, energetic, kind of, full of fight. Joe Biden less so. And I know he has to say he's going to run in 2024, because if you don't say you're going to run, you're a lame duck immediately, and all you're going to do is, fire the starting gun for who is going to succeed him. Kamala Harris is not doing that well, I would say, at the moment as the vice president. So who the Democrats put up in 2024 is a very interesting and open question. What the Republicans will do, whether they are able to move on at all from Donald Trump, or whether the shadow of Donald Trump will still play a sizable role, is also unknown. America is trying to emerge from the pandemic. Joe Biden wants to get this big infrastructure bill passed, which, if he manages to get it done, I think would be a big deal, because I don't know how many of you have driven in America recently, have been through American airports or American railways. My God, is there a need for the infrastructure to be updated? So I think that there is a fantastically interesting battles ahead. I think that Biden has been no means catastrophic, but I think that people who were hoping that this would be a whole new dawn, and I think particularly in the international community, they are wondering whether what Joe Biden is offering is America back or America first under new management. And there I will leave it, and we can discuss some of these issues.
Right, well, thank you so much, John. That's a sort of rather rapid whirlwind tour de force, I should say, of American politics just over the last couple of years. I wanted to ask you a couple of things, and then there are some questions coming in from the audience. You talked a little bit about what had been going on around January the 6th in relation to the sort of threat to American democracy. And there seems to be more stuff coming out all the time. I'm thinking of Bob Woodward's book, which I'm not sure has even been published yet, Peril, which has got, numbers of revelations or more detail about, for example, the plan that Trump had got and was being put up to Pence to overturn the election results. Quite a detailed plan, it turned out. And Pence says, sorry, you can't do that. And Trump says, well, you won't be my friend anymore, which tells you something very interesting, I think, about the psychology of Trump. I mean, it's it's a sort of toddler tantrum kind of response.
Those are words you wouldn't hear me use on the BBC News at 10. I think toddler tantrum might get me into a spot of bother.
But I think it's a bit characteristic of the man. You won't be my friend anymore. The question is, I think, how close was American democracy to the brink? And with Trump still being around, is there a real threat to it? Or is there a possibility that there were other people around Trump. I mean, I just had this rather naive sort of feeling that if Trump went really off the rails, there would be people around, a few generals perhaps, who just kind of take him out one way or another, or sort of lock him up. and so it appeared in the latest Woodward revelation as somebody writing to the Chinese saying, don't worry, you know, we're not going to attack you. I mean, but how near were things to just going completely wrong and off the rails, do you think?
So that's a very interesting question, because I think that what emerged after January the 6th was two narratives. One is narrative one, this shows just how brilliant the US Constitution is. That you can bend it, but it won't break. And the checks and balances, the three, you know, co-equal branches of government, of the, you know, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature is what you need, and that worked. And you know, and the whole American Constitution was designed to stop overmighty, overpowerful people. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. I think it's completely wrong. I think that what the events of January the 6th showed was just the fragility and the brittleness of the US Constitution, and that but for the actions of literally a handful of people, you know, the Secretary of State in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, who was rung up by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump said, find me another 11,780 votes so that I win the state. And Brad Raffensperger, even though he was a Republican, said, no way, you didn't win those votes. There was the same thing happened in Michigan, where Donald Trump lost by a much larger margin. And there were a couple of officials there who said, no way. Likewise, the state governor in Arizona, which Donald Trump lost and couldn't believe that he had lost. So there were a few people who did what they were meant to do. Mike Pence has a ceremonial role on that day, on January the 6th. It was there to certify the results after every Secretary of State had done their job. And yet there were 170 members of the House of Representatives, Republicans, who did not vote to certify Joe Biden's victory. Now, that is extraordinary. And I've spoken to some of those people, and what they will tell you quietly, when the camera's not rolling, when the microphones are switched off, is that, of course, they knew Joe Biden had won. But Donald Trump didn't believe it, and they didn't want to upset Donald Trump, because also an awful lot of their voters believed it, because they believed Donald Trump when he said, it's been stolen, it's a con, it's been rigged. So I think that far from the constitutional arrangements showing their durability, I think it was the fragility of US democracy that was on show. And look, you know, the danger point has passed. I remember Paddy Ashdown with a very vivid description of the situation in Bosnia, which he said it's like a lemonade bottle that you've been shaking, and you hold it and it looks fine, but unscrew the top and it will all come out. And I sort of think there is a truth about that, about America today as well, that Joe Biden is trying to lower the temperature, but the countervailing forces are such that there are so many people who still either believe that Donald Trump, you know, had the election stolen from him, or that Donald Trump should be locked up. And it doesn't seem to be much kind of middle ground at all. And that's a difficulty for America going forward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I sort of remember talking about, you know, what Republicans believe in relation to whether the election was actually won or not. And it seems to me that it's been going on for an awfully long time, because I remember there was a poll sometime after the Iraq War where Americans were asked about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And certainly a majority of Republicans, if I remember it rightly, thought that not only were there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but they'd been found, for which there was no evidence whatsoever. And so it seems like, you know, there is an extent to which, you know, history repeats itself, and people are for some reason or other, prepared to accept things which there is no evidence, which is very worrying. And under those circumstances, people can perhaps take extreme actions, because one's worried about the sort of people who are gathering at Capitol Hill, how much support they've got in the country. Obviously not a majority, but very large numbers of people, particularly in some local Republican parties. They practically control them, as I understand it. So, I mean, do you think these people are potentially a real danger?
I think in certain circumstances there is a real danger. Yeah, I don't want to overstate it, and I think that the powers that be are. I think that the focus of, I mean, you mentioned the Iraq War. Look, since 9/11, the almost exclusive focus of American national security policy has been the external threat of jihadists, essentially coming and doing damage on American soil. And understandably, after 9/11, you would be. But there is a domestic threat as well in the United States, which also needs addressing. And I think that is the rebalancing that has taken place during this administration. But there are attempts to rewrite what happened on January the 6th already. That this was that the police opened the doors and let them in. They weren't violent. It was just a boisterous protest, and these were good patriots. There are serious politicians who are saying that is what happened. You just have to look at the pictures of what happened to see that it was very violent. The police were attacked, and I think that that we have to tackle falsehood. And yeah, people will believe what they want to believe, but we've got to somehow give people the facts so that when, I take a lot of heat, or have done over the past, from Trump supporters who said, you're just anti-Trump, you're just this, you're just that. And then I write very damning series of blogs about Joe Biden and Afghanistan. And they say, but you facilitated, you changed your tune now. And I said, no, I just hold people in power to account, whoever they are, whether they are Joe Biden, whether they are Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, whoever it happens to be. Our job is to speak truth to power. And I think we've got to do that job fearlessly.
Just to go back to the 6th question from Romy Romweber, who says, were the mob on the 6th really ready to find and lynch Pence? Were Confederate flags flying at the Capitol on the 6th?
Yes and yes. I mean, they were. They
would have lynched him.
Yeah, honestly, I think it could have been. The Secret Service were terrified. The Secret Service you watch him as they jostle him down the stairs and take him to safety in a secure room. And all this time, Donald Trump is being begged to call, to intervene, to try and stop this. And if you look at the messages that Trump put out, he did say, be peaceful, but he was also saying he was also inciting by saying this is what happens when people feel that their election has been stolen from them, yada, yada, yada. So there was a long period where Donald Trump was being pleaded with, call this off, tell people to stop. And in the initial stages, it was absolutely clear Donald Trump was loving it. He loved the fact that these people were doing this for him. And let me make a very quick, neat, illustrative point about the power he has over the Republican Party. There's a guy called Kevin McCarthy, who is the minority leader of the Republicans, so the opposition leader in the House of Representatives. Pelosi's the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy's. And Kevin McCarthy made a speech the day after, 2 days after January the 6th, and said, Donald Trump bears responsibility for what has happened here. About 2 or 3 weeks later, he's called down to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's country house. And after that, he suddenly is not saying Donald Trump was responsible for any of it, because he was scared of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump calls him down. Kevin McCarthy has to bend the knee, kiss the ring, and is rewriting history. That's what happened.
Right. Just looking a little further ahead as far as Trump is concerned, question from Alison Jameson, who says, are there likely to be criminal charges brought against Trump for attempted manipulation of the Georgia vote count? And I suppose you might talk generally about, I mean, there's a host of charges against Trump on all sorts of grounds to do with, you know, both political, financial, so on and so forth. I mean, what do you think is likely to be the process and outcome of any of those? What impact might those have on whether Trump himself could stand again for the presidency?
So let me just pick you up on one word you use, which is charges. There are investigations going on. There are no charges against Donald Trump at the moment. There are two investigations that are substantive and interesting to watch. One is the Georgia investigation. It's actually not being conducted by the state of Georgia. It's actually being done by Macomb County, which is essentially this county that takes in Atlanta, the biggest city in the state, where there is a big Democrat majority. And that is interesting in that there is, you know, we have the transcript, we have the recording of the conversation that Trump had with the Secretary of State, where he's trying to strong arm him to give him votes. There is a charge of election interference, and if that ain't election interference, it's hard to know what would constitute. But you know, they might bring that charge, and Donald Trump will have a defense saying, well, look, it was freedom of speech, and I was, you know, of course I wasn't telling him to do this. I think the more interesting one is what's happening in the Southern District of New York, and the New York attorney, Cy Vance, and the investigations that are going on into the Trump empire. And that is a much wider investigation. They have Trump's tax records. We don't know where that will go, and whether it will go anywhere, and whether it will lead to prosecutions. Of course, there was a second impeachment of Donald Trump, and it was the most bipartisan. I mean, there was a great piece of political chicanery that went on with that second indictment of Trump, because if they had voted to convict in that second the second impeachment trial, then he couldn't stand for office again. That would be the penalty of having been found guilty. But what Mitch McConnell, the wily Republican leader, who said Donald Trump should be held responsible and said Donald Trump has done wrong, he then only agreed to the trial taking place after Donald Trump had left office. And then when the trial started, McConnell said, well, we can't convict him because he's already left office. Well, yeah, you're only having the trial afterwards because that's when you set the date for it. And so, you know, so I think that my suspicion, I may be completely wrong, that there will be legal jeopardy, there will be things that will be embarrassing to Donald Trump, but there will not be a killer legal blow to him. And that it will be other factors that are more to do with conventional politics, his poll standing, other things that might have changed. You know, Donald Trump is 74, it's another 3 years to go till you get to the next election. There's nothing automatic that says he's going to run. I think it's still a long, long way away.
Right, question that turns more to journalism from Flo, who says, you highlighted the crucial importance and need of proper probing journalism today. Do you therefore despair of the standard of journalism in America?
Let me qualify that. There's been some fantastic investigative journalism by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by the Wall Street Journal, and others, where they have really invested a lot of resource, a lot of time, a lot of fact checking, a lot of effort into delivering stories. Donald Trump's great political insight, and I think Boris Johnson probably has it too, is that people's memories are short. That people, you can see, you know, so I would see these stories land in the New York Times with a thud, and you think, holy mother, this is huge. He's in real trouble now. And it's kind of, you know, all the networks are running with it. It's getting colossal coverage. And 2 days later, it has been replaced by another new, oh my God, this is epic. And so you are tempted, so I would find myself in the evening thinking, well, historians sit with pen poised to rewrite the chapters of da 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 da, with a kind of great pompous and portentous sort of words. And then to find that 2 days later, I can't even remember what it was that I was hyperventilating about 2 days earlier. And I think that, so I don't blame American media. I do think that American TV has a lot to answer for, in that, look, and I'm not just talking about the BBC when I talk about good journalism, I'm talking about ITV and I'm talking about Sky, all of whom I think do great works. We're different, we've got slightly different priorities, each of us, but it's fact-driven news. Whereas if I was to turn on the TV now, if I turn on Fox News, I will find them laughing at Joe Biden, saying how awful he is. And if I turn on CNN, they'll be going on about the latest Trump outrage of what he might have said. So I think that TV has become so partisan that people are only ever hearing their views that they already have echoing back to them. And I think this echo chamber effect is really bad for democracy. People turn on the news not to have their views challenged, but to have them affirmed. And I think that sometimes we need to be going, not sometimes, I think that all the time, we ought to be saying, have you thought of that? Or this is what makes this interesting is something else. And I don't think that American TV does anything like enough of that. And you watch CNN and they'll have a whole panel, 6 people will be in boxes on the television screen, and they'll all be essentially agreeing with the presenter's viewpoint. And what you don't have enough is people being challenged, reasoned argument. And there isn't enough of that.
Question from Peter Darley, and this is about the UK's relationship to the US. And he says, does Johnson see the USA as an unpredictable teenager? And how can the UK act as the adult in the relationship?
Or vice versa. I think that, I think the special relationship is such a fascinating topic and such a sort of impossible to grab hold of thing. Politicians in the UK are desperate, so you cannot believe the effort that has gone on this week. Boris Johnson had to be in New York for UNGA, the UN General Assembly. Joe Biden had to be in New York this week for the UN General Assembly. Where is the logical place to meet? New York. They're both going to be in New York. Boris Johnson didn't want to meet in New York in some meeting room. He wanted the White House. He wanted the Oval Office. Diplomats thought look, I know this for a fact. Enormous effort was made to persuade the White House to allow this meeting to take place in Washington. So there are parts of the special relationship which are frankly, can I say bullshit? Bullshit. Where you think, look what happened over Afghanistan. The British weren't consulted. It was delivered as a fait accompli. I thought the criticism of Johnson in the Commons that, what a failure and how embarrassing that Britain is just pulling its troops out because America is. What else could Boris Johnson do? What could any British Prime Minister of whatever political stripe have done if the president chooses to go his own way when nearly all the military force in the country is American? Are you going to leave the British troops entirely exposed to the Taliban to be there by themselves? Of course not. British had no choice whatsoever. It was high-handed behavior by an American president. And if you look back at history, even go to the high point of the special relationship, Thatcher Reagan. Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada, which was part of the Commonwealth, without saying a word to Thatcher. And it has happened throughout history. We are the junior partner. America has interests, not friendships. Now, there are parts of it that are very important that I think that you look at this intelligence sharing that goes on between the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the Five Eyes Agreement. You look at what's just happened in recent days, the UK, US, Australia agreement, AUKUS. You look at some other things as well, the number of British troops that are embedded with American units and American servicemen and women who are embedded with British units. That is all real. But the idea I always thought was absolutely fictitious, that Britain would get a great trade deal from Donald Trump. Do me a favor. The US trade representatives are going to strike the best deal for Americans. And so the idea that we are going to get special favors from the Americans seems to me incredibly wide of the mark. All of that said, I think the relationship is very important. And if you're a British Prime Minister, you can't just say, oh, I don't give a damn about America. Well, most of our export, it's the biggest single country that we export to. Single country. Obviously, the biggest trading bloc we export to is still the European Union, but the biggest single country is the United States. So we have to care deeply about what the relationship is with the US. But I think that, listen, the special relationship is something that British politicians talk an awful lot about, and that American politicians only mention when they know they've got a Brit in the room, because they know that's what the Brit wants to hear. But you will then go to so look at the different formulations from the Obama administration, where Britain, the special relationship, Germany, our closest partner, Mexico, our nearest neighbor, France, our oldest partner. You could just find different ways to pretend that everyone was special. And I think that Britain needs to grow up a bit in terms of its relationship with the US.
Yeah, throws up all sorts of interesting questions about the way in which, we have, to some extent, cut our ties with the European Union in the search for a deepening of the special relationship, which you're saying is not really so special at all.
I'm not going to go down the post-Brexit scenario. All I would say is there was never very much chance of a swift trade deal with the US. It's not on Biden's radar at all. Biden is much more focused on American jobs for American workers, and international trade deals are a distraction. And if there is going to be a trade deal, who needs that trade deal more? Does the US need a trade deal with the UK, or does the UK need a trade deal with the US? I would say it's the latter. And given that, who's going to come out on top when America holds all the cards?
Right. You can work that out. Just to go back to Biden a bit. Now, there was a question partly covered, I think, which was how much has Biden's reputation been damaged domestically by the Afghan debacle? And as you say, I mean, his popularity seems to be dropping at the moment. But do you think this is going to be of long-term import, or is it not the case that the American public is really not so interested in getting involved in long-term military engagements, and that the apparent debacle of the leaving is something which would be perhaps a fairly short-term impact? I mean, what do you think? Is this going to play out as significant long-term?
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment, actually, because I think that ultimately what is costing Biden dear in the polls at the moment is actually not so much Afghanistan as the fact that Biden said, with me, there will be competence, we're going to get COVID under control, and the number of cases has been soaring. Now, rather unfairly, he is taking he's copping it for the fact that so many Americans have refused to get vaccinated. The vaccines are there, it's just that Americans are choosing not to be vaccinated, and it's got caught up in the whole issue of culture wars. I think that on Afghanistan, I think there was widespread support from Americans for withdrawal. There wasn't widespread support for people clinging to the side of a C-17 transporter aircraft. There wasn't support for helicopters rushing to and from the US Embassy to Kabul airport. There wasn't support for the fact that, you know, an awful lot of people have been left behind. But I think the idea of saying, right, you know, Biden was able to stand up at the UN this week and say, for the first time in 20 years, a US president is able to come here and say, American troops are not at war. And I think that Biden thinks that that is probably a message that will resonate longer and deeper than whatever the short-term price will be over the manner of the departure.
One other thing about Biden and the future, which I'd be grateful if you could comment on, and then we'll probably wind things up. And we talked a bit at the beginning about sort of threats to American democracy, and there are various sort of, you know, issues going on at the moment in relation to changes in voting procedures and so on, which may have an impact on that. And there are two potential avenues for Biden of a legalistic nature, which it's been talked about him pursuing. It's not clear whether those will happen. One is to change the balance of the Supreme Court, be by electing or appointing another two, at least, liberally inclined judges to help restore somewhat the balance. And the other thing is the removal of the filibuster. And these are sort of tricky issues, and I'd be grateful if you could perhaps just talk for a few minutes or a couple of minutes about those, and then we'll bring things to a close.
Wow, we're getting into the constitutional weeds now as we go, reach the end of our conversation. The thing to say for those who don't follow American politics that closely is that the Supreme Court plays a really significant role in American public life in a way that it does not in the UK. An awful lot of Americans would be able to name you most of the members of the Supreme Court. I would challenge, even in Belsize Park, anyone to be able to stand, you know, on the street and get anyone to name the members of the English Supreme Court. I just don't think they would be able to do it. The Supreme Court will weigh on all the most contentious issues of the day: gun rights, abortion, gay rights, you name it. If it gets really super contentious, it ends up at the Supreme Court. And the suggestion has been, and you know, the other thing I would say is I didn't talk about it in my quick tour d'horizon of Donald Trump. Donald Trump's lasting legacy is the courts, is the fact that he managed to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices that have now tilted the court in a much more conservative direction. I don't think Biden will go down the route of packing the Supreme Court, because then what's to stop whoever else becomes the president packing it still further, and it just becomes meaningless. I mean, I think that the problem with the American Supreme Court is that the justices are appointed for life. It used to be the case, you know, go back 150 years, and the people would be in their 60s when they got appointed, and they would die when they are in their early 70s. Now they're being appointed in their 40s and living on until their late 80s. So, you know, the most recent appointment, Amy Coney Barrett, she's only about 40 years old, she could be on the Supreme Court for 45 years, perfectly reasonably. And so that is one of the problems you've got. And I don't see that Biden will want to tackle that. And the filibuster, which, if I can express it very simply, in essence means that to get any legislation, meaningful legislation passed, you need 60 votes in the Senate out of 100. And at the moment, the Democrats have got 50. And if you say, right, well, let's just make it a simple majority, and you abandon the filibuster, then yes, it's true that Biden would be able to get a lot more legislation through right now with a good deal less fuss. But what happens when the Republicans retake control? Then Democrats will be absolutely powerless. So you've got to be careful. You can reap what you sow. Now, that is the arguments. It would be a huge gamble for Biden to try to either pack the Supreme Court or to tinker substantially with the filibuster. So although there'll be talk and there'll be threats, I think he will recoil from doing it. And remember, Joe Biden is a creature of the Senate. He spent over 3 decades there. So this is kind of his natural home. And I think he would be very wary about doing that. And also he's got, there are these 2 Democrat senators, Kristen Sinema in Arizona, and a guy called Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who are both Democrats in very conservative areas. They're not going to support that. So Biden might not even have the votes to tackle the filibuster or to do anything about the Supreme Court. So even if he wanted to, he would be thwarted by his own side.
Well, thanks very much, John. I feel we could go on with this all night, but I do realize you've got other things to do. There was a final question, which is perhaps just a way of rounding things off, which is what next for you after your American posting? So I think I can reasonably ask that as a goodbye question, as it were.
It's a good question. I was that from my wife, by the way?
No, it wasn't.
because it is a question that she also asks. Look, there are things that are being discussed with the BBC at the moment. I've loved my career. If there's a good job to do, fantastic. If not, what a way to go out after 38 years in the BBC, having been the BBC's North America editor, for this privileged, extraordinary ringside view, flying on Air Force One with the president and doing things that I could have never imagined doing, going to places. So I've had the most wonderful time. So I'm still kind of slightly fixed on doing what I'm doing, but I suppose I'll soon have to start thinking about what comes next.
Right. Well, I'm rather hoping that we see you back on the streets around Belsize Park in the
I'm sure you will.
That would be nice, and maybe we can get you to come to the library when we're actually
I'd love to.
Back to physical meetings. So thank you so much. Just to say to everybody again that sorry, I lost the recording for a minute. Oh, just to say to everyone, thank you for coming. Please do look in the chat, where at the top of the chat I posted the donation site. So do have a look at that. Click on it before it disappears, and then you'll have it ready to think about donating. And we have another couple of meetings coming up in the next 2 months, which I just mentioned quickly. And that is on the 21st of August. Karin Fernald, who's well known to many of us, will be talking about Edwin Landseer. And on the 18th of November, Lee Turner, ambassador to Austria, will be talking something about the relationship of writing and diplomacy. And these are just some of the characters that we have living around Belsize Park. And so we're most grateful for all of them for coming along and helping us out. So with that, I'll say good night to everybody, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.